All right, y'all. You're locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we're giving you an update on how long we can expect Drake London to be out with a knee injury and which receiver is going to step up in his absence, and whether or not that could be Bryan Edwards, who could use this opportunity to usurp London as the Falcons' number one wide receiver.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka your very humble podcast host. Of course, I've been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And I thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify. And of course, Monday through Friday, you can also check us out on YouTube. And if you hit that bell, you like and subscribe, you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So for those of you checking us out on YouTube, tonight, this episode is dropping a little later than usual, but that's owed to the fact that the Falcons had a night practice at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Sort of want to wait to see how that went before talking with you guys. And today we're going to be talking all about the wide receiver position, in part due to getting an update on Sunday about Drake London's potential absence from that knee injury that he suffered early in Friday night's preseason opener against the Detroit Lions. And from all indications, of course, Arthur Smith is not very forthcoming with injury information, but at least this time gave us a little bit more, like 12% more than what we are used to, and sort of indicated that it's nothing serious, it's nothing long-term, which was sort of what the initial prognosis and expectations were, and that Drake London appears to be on track to return week one. That's sort of the expectation. And so now the question is really, okay, if he's good to go for week one against the Saints, for 4 weeks from now, it's the question of whether we'll see him between now and then in the preseason. Playing against the Jets seems at this point in time unlikely, given, some people saying that he's probably going to miss a couple of days of practice, if not the entire week of practice leading up to that game. I guess the question really now is, is his ability to play against the Jaguars in the preseason finale later this month, that's kind of up in the air. So I don't expect, this is me speculating and guessing here, but I don't expect the Falcons to rush him back. I think the goal is to keep him healthy so that he's on track for week one. So there's no real need to rush him back. I guess we're just kind of, for me, I'm kind of looking at it. I'm circling that September 1st date. That if Drake London's not back practicing by that point in time, then I'll start to be concerned about his status for week one. That'll give him basically a couple of days leading up to the week one practices that you want him to be healthy for and ready to go for, so that he can participate in week one. And so September 1st is basically 2 weeks away. So that gives him basically 2 full weeks to recover from whatever the specific knee issue he's having. Obviously, Arthur Smith is not going to disclose the exact nature of that knee injury, but his extended absence does open opportunities for other players. It also potentially throws a wrench into the hopes that he and the Falcons offense could hit the ground running immediately in week one, particularly for those of you that are, having much higher hopes and optimism for what the Falcons can do this upcoming season. We kind of saw this with Kyle Pitts last year, given his limited exposure in the preseason. It's not to say that Kyle Pitts was bad or unproductive in those first couple of games of the season, but his production was kind of sporadic those first 3 or so games. And I think that was probably a contributing factor, not the main factor, but certainly a contributing factor to the offense's relatively slow start in those first 3 or so games. So we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. But then again, you could sit there and say, well, Jamar Chase had 1 catch in the preseason last year and had 4 drops in the preseason last year in 3 games, and then went out in week 1 against the Vikings and had 100 yards receiving. So, there's no direct correlation between how productive you are in the preseason versus how productive you're going to be, coming out of the gates in the NFL season. So we'll see how Drake London fits into that paradigm. Does he sort of, skew one side or the other, I guess. It's not something I'm too worried about, Drake London coming out of the gates and needing to produce 100 yards receiving or 80 yards receiving or something like that in week 1, because, I am a serious person who has more long-term outlooks, because, I'm not concerned with having high expectations in 2022. It's more about the long-term rebuild that the Falcons are undergoing. So we'll see how that all plays out. So I'm not too worried about Drake London long-term, but certainly short-term, if you're wanting him to, come out of the gates firing and lighten up Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo, who, from what I hear, is having a great camp with the Saints. Maybe this potentially derails those hopes, but we'll just sort of have to see. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, opens the door for other receivers to get some of these reps. If Drake London is held out of practice for the next week or two, it will give those guys potential, assuming Drake London misses at least the Jets game, more guys potential to step up in his void. We saw Geronimo Allison sort of step into the starting lineup for the Falcons on that opening drive when Drake London got injured against the Lions. And we'll talk about Geronimo Allison and Auden Tate and some of these guys that, are sort of chomping at the bit to take advantage of Drake London's potential absence in the coming weeks. So we'll get into that, guys, as we continue today's episode. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 shows with 4 hosts breaking down local sports as well as national sports, as A to Z with Mark Zinno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Locked On Sports Atlanta is the home of the Locked On Braves postcast on YouTube, as well as the Locked On Falcons postcast on YouTube. If you missed it Friday night, Jarvis and I went live reacting to Friday night's preseason game, and we will plan on going live every night, or not every night, every time after a Falcons game. So next Monday night against the Jets, then later against the Jaguars, and of course Sundays and the occasional Thursday or Saturday sprinkled in the regular season as well. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube to get that. And if you're missing the YouTube version of that, guys, you can also still check out those podcasts on the Locked On Falcons podcast feed as well moving forward. So subscribe to both on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I want to tell you about Athletic Greens, who have a product that I use literally every day. I started taking AG1 because I realized we all can be healthier these days. And AG1 is like taking a multivitamin where you don't have to take a million different little pills. It's just 1 scoop of AG1 with a cup of water first thing in the morning, and my day starts off right. And including in AG1 is 75 high quality vitamins, minerals, superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens, all in a special blend of ingredients that improves gut health, your immune system, boosts energy, recovery, and focus throughout the day. You can too reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition with AG1. Making it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free year-long supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs of AG1 with your first purchase. All you have to do is go to athleticgreens.com/NFL network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NFL network to take ownership of your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. So as we referred earlier on today's episode, Drake London's absence is going to open the opportunities for other receivers, right? I often use 2015 analogies in comparisons on this podcast from training camp, just because that was a very interesting training camp, just because new coaching staff, all that sort of stuff. So a lot more things were in flux. And I think even though this is not a brand new coaching staff, we still are in sort of that flux mode. But I remember, in 2015, we didn't know going into training camp who was going to be the starting running back. Was it going to be Devontae Freeman? Was it going to be Tevin Coleman? Both of those guys got hurt in training camp. Tevin Coleman recovered from, I think, hamstring injury earlier than Devontae Freeman, and so therefore by default won the starting tailback position. Then he got hurt, and then Devontae Freeman then sort of took that job and retained that job from there to eternity, much to the chagrin of Tevin Coleman fans out there. But these injuries happen all the time in the preseason, and that creates opportunities. Is basically the moral of that story. And in the case of Drake London, who got the start as the Falcons' X wide receiver, which is sort of the featured receiver in this sort of Shanahan derivative West Coast offense that Arthur Smith runs. We saw Julio Jones, play that role in Atlanta for years and be the featured receiver. We saw AJ Brown be that in Tennessee under Arthur Smith and be the featured receiver, although, not from a target standpoint, but that he was the guy that you were sort of game planning to stop when you face Tennessee. No offense to Corey Davis. And so we saw, as I mentioned earlier, Geronimo Allison sort of step into that role. We've talked about Auden Tate's fit as sort of that X wide receiver. And so both of these guys, two guys that I don't personally expect to, make the roster. At least I do think that both of those guys have good shots of making the practice squad. But this is kind of the opportunity I think both of these guys need if they're going to increase those odds of making the roster and wind up proving me wrong, which, of course, we know cannot happen because I've never been wrong before. But I think with Allison and Tate, as I said, this is a golden opportunity for both of these guys. But we've touched upon these issues in the past, but part of the reason why I have not been high on their potential to make the team is, even though I think they have obviously an NFL skill set, they've been productive in the NFL when they've had opportunities to play. Allison in Green Bay, Tate in Cincinnati in the 1 year where AJ Green was hurt before the arrival of sort of Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. And so we've seen these guys produce, but I think for that X wide receiver role in this offense, they're not really ideal, right? I think part of it, in not projecting these guys to make the roster is because I think the Falcons have an overabundance of X receivers, right? You have Drake London sort of in that role. You have Bryan Edwards, who played that similar role in the Raiders West Coast offense under John Gruden last year. And I don't think you really need more than that. And then, the other thing I've mentioned before is like Kyle Pitts kind of was sort of a hybrid role of that last year for the Falcons because they didn't have that X receiver after the Julio Jones trade. And so you're kind of already have 2.5 sort of X receivers. You don't really need to keep a third on the roster. You need more complementary weapons in that regard. And so that's one of the reasons why I've not been high on Allison or Tate making a roster. The other aspect of it is kind of ideally when in this Arthur Smith offense, the X wide receiver, at least how AJ Brown was utilized, a lot of it is sort of, yak ability. And that's not really something that Allison and Tate have excelled in. And so, what that yak ability is, what you're looking for, sort of the bread and butter play or bread and butter route that Arthur Smith likes to run in this offense. And we saw a ton in Tennessee. We saw it a ton last year where they kind of were square pegging Calvin Ridley to kind of do this stuff. And he wasn't a great fit in that. But it's the dig route, right? And that's sort of the in-breaking route. Usually it's like 10 to 12-yard route. And AJ Brown was exceptionally good at sort of catching those 10 and 12-yard digs and turning them into big plays. And that was, a big reason why AJ Brown was so successful in that offense and was one of the more dangerous receivers in the league. Desmond Trufant felt that quite a bit in that 2019 game against AJ Brown when the Falcons played the Titans and the last great hurrah of Marcus Mariota in his time in Tennessee. So, the issue I have with, Allison and Tate is like, they're not really great yak receivers. And so that's part of it where it's like, if they were like prime yak receivers, I think the Falcons would be able to justify keeping these guys as a third X or whatever the case may be. And I know I always say whatever the case may be. I'm trying to stop it, but at least I'm catching myself saying it sometimes now. But you look at the numbers, you look at Pro Football Focus and you look at their numbers in terms of what their yak yards are, their average yards after catch per reception, and also look at the missed tackles forced that they have where they're basically breaking tackles. That was something that AJ Brown was exceptional at in Tennessee, right? If you look at AJ Brown's career in Tennessee, he's averaged about 6.1 yards per reception after catch, which is very good. And about, if you divide the number of broken tackles he's created versus how many receptions he's had about 40 broken tackles on, or missed tackles forced missed tackles, however you want to refer to it, on 185 catches. That means about 22% of his catches feature a broken tackle. And then you compare that to Geronimo Allison, who's averaging about 4.6 yards after catch per reception, which is not a bad number. But throughout his career in Green Bay and bouncing around other places like Detroit, he's only created forced missed tackles on about 5% of his receptions, which is a very low number. Auden Tate's better, not in terms of average yards after catch per reception. It's 3.6, but he is creating more forced missed tackles, about 13%, in part due to the increased size. But while those numbers are better than Allison and certainly don't quite pale in comparison to A.J. Brown, they're about on par with what Russell Gage did. And no one would describe Russell Gage as a great after catch receiver. Certainly not terrible, but certainly that wasn't a strength of his. He averaged about 3.7 yards after catch, so basically the same as Tate's 3.6, and had about 12% missed tackles forced on his receptions, slightly below Tate's 13%. But when you look at those numbers, you don't really see Allison and Tate really having the sort of quote unquote ideal skill set for that X wide receiver. Again, we don't have the numbers to really back it up, or at least in apples to apples comparison when we use Drake London's numbers from college. But certainly he created a number of missed tackles after the catch. Wasn't necessarily a guy that was running away from cornerbacks in the Pac-12, but certainly was a guy that really fought hard for every single yard he got after the catch. So we'll see if that translates for him being that A.J. Brown-esque receiver. But what's notable is Bryan Edwards, a player that played that X receiver role in the Raiders, again, on a limited sample size, put up numbers very comparable to A.J. Brown. And sort of we'll wrap up today's episode talking about Bryan Edwards' sort of potential to be that sort of featured X that A.J. Brown was. And could that mean that he could wind up being the number one receiver moving forward for the Falcons? And we'll break down some of the reasons why that is possible as we continue today's episode. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the other shows on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, including Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs. Go check out, whatever local Atlanta or Georgia sports team that is your favorite on your preferred podcast platform, all on the same ones that you are currently subscribed and listening to or watching Locked On Falcons, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and YouTube. And guys, it's almost the start of the NFL season. And if you're into sports betting or fantasy and you're looking for that competitive edge to help you win, I highly recommend the Elias Game Plan app. It's the ultimate sports betting and fantasy companion for the NFL, the NBA, and the MLB. Elias Game Plan is the only sports app from the most trusted name in sports stats. That's the Elias Sports Bureau, official statisticians of the U.S. pro sports leagues, including the NFL. Their app is the one-stop source for team and player stats, head-to-head comparisons, expert analysis. It's perfect for the preseason to help you get insight, to help you draft a winning fantasy team so that you'll be ready when the regular season kicks off. Elias is the most respected research team in the industry, and you guys know how much I love well-researched analysis. It's the perfect app for me, and you can take my advice and download the Elias Game Plan app today. New features are available all the time to help you take your game to the next level. NFL season is right around the corner, so don't wait. Find the Elias Game Plan app in the App Store or Play Store today. And guys, if you haven't tried the Built Bar Puff flavors, you're depriving yourself of one of life's greatest joys, that fluffy, marshmallowy deliciousness covered in chocolate. You can try out their new flavor like the coconut cookie dough chunk puff, or maybe you want to get caught in the rain with the pina colada. There's also the brownie batter puff, banana cream pie, and churro puff flavors. And if you don't know about Built Bars, they're the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. Built Bars are even better than a candy bar because they're not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, calories, carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. And whether you're getting those puff limited time flavors or you're getting tried and trues like cookies and cream, double chocolate, coconut almond, cherry barcia, mint brownie, peanut butter brownie, salted caramel, raspberry, and more, find your favorite or order yourself a mix box to try them all by going to built.com and use the promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKEDON15, LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. So let's wrap up today's Locked On Falcons here, talking more about Bryan Edwards and talking about his breakout potential and maybe Drake London's absence should Bryan Edwards return to practice this week and certainly get some action in the games, may lead himself to be more of that breakout star that we're hoping for this offense to have and feature this upcoming season. We know Bryan Edwards missed Friday's preseason game against the Lions due to the shoulder injury he suffered earlier this month. He has been practicing with a yellow non-contact jersey all last week. He did miss Monday night's practice at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, but not due to injury because he was with he's dealing with the birth of a child. And I want to read you guys one of my jokes because I have to feed my ego on this podcast. And so what did Tori McElhaney tweet? She said, Arthur Smith said Bryan Edwards will not be at practice tonight. His fiance had a baby, so it's all good news. And I said, congrats to Bryan Edwards. Looking forward to him adding to the family when he also makes NFC South cornerbacks his sons. So again, I'm hilarious. Really appreciate that, guys. But I think Bryan Edwards is interesting because when, just citing some of the AJ Brown after catch numbers, again, given a larger sample size that AJ Brown has had playing multiple seasons in the NFL, and Bryan Edwards hasn't had that same sample size in part due to injuries limiting him as a rookie, and then sort of being the number 3 guy with the Raiders last year. But when you look at throw sample size away, just look at the numbers and look at yards per reception after the catch and missed tackles force, the percentage per reception is basically identical in terms of production as what AJ Brown. Like AJ Brown, as I remind you, had about 6 yards per reception after the catch, 6.1 to be exact. Bryan Edwards was 5.9. AJ Brown forced missed tackles on 21.6% of his receptions. Bryan Edwards forced it on 22.2%. So 6 yards after catch, 22% forced missed tackles. Same thing. Again, obviously, AJ Brown has about 4 times as many catches and 4 times as many opportunities. So has proven it over a larger sample size. But at least theoretically, if you want to buy stock on, one of these wide receivers in addition to Drake London, maybe we should buy stock on Bryan Edwards. And this was something I think I talked with Dave Choate about 3 weeks ago on the podcast, talking about, and I think I used the analogy of sort of, one of my favorite ones, where if someone ran up to me, sort of out of breath, being like, Aaron, Bryan Edwards winds up leading the team in receiving yards and receptions this year. He says, I'm from the future first. And Bryan Edwards winds up doing that and winds up having the 80-ish catches, the 1,000-ish yards, and the 7 or 8-ish touchdowns that I think a lot of people are expecting from a number 1 receiver in this year's offense. And if that person told me it was Bryan Edwards, I wouldn't look at that person like they're a crazy person. I'd be like, maybe you are from the future. Tell me more, that sort of thing. And so that's basically my way of saying, like, I think Bryan Edwards, has some breakout potential. Not only does he have experience playing at X wide receiver role in a West Coast style of offense, which he did it with the Raiders last year, and again, that's the sort of feature role within this Arthur Smith offense. But he also kind of has a little bit more of a rapport with Marcus Mariota, the current starter of the Atlanta Falcons, from their shared days in Las Vegas the last couple of years. And so, given, what I said earlier, London's absence may lead to him taking a little bit more time to build that rapport with Mariota, who we expect to start the season as the Falcons starter. That may give Bryan Edwards an opportunity to sort of, hit the ground running in that. And so we'll see if he can. We'll see what, London can do when he gets back to the lineup. But both of these guys having sort of breakout years, I think is going to be critical, particularly for those of you that, are hopeful and optimistic that the Falcons are going to make some noise this year, especially offensively, because, we need explosiveness. I think explosiveness is going to be the thing that has the greatest potential to unlock this Falcons offense to overachieve, at least based off of my expectations, but to potentially achieve, if you have, as many of you guys do, have much higher expectations. I know a lot of people's hopes and expectations on this year's team and this year's offense is tied to the belief that the Falcons have made significant upgrades to their wide receiver core, as opposed to other areas of their offensive roster where you can make the argument they basically, made lateral moves and or downgraded in certain areas. But, that wide receiver core and its explosiveness is potentially going to be the key. And that may be something that we'll elaborate further on, sort of the exact mechanism of that moving forward. But it'll be interesting to see sort of if the Falcons can achieve that explosiveness this season. How do they do it? Do they do it within the structure of the offense? Right. And that sort of that means either London or Edwards kind of is that sort of AJ Brown-esque X receiver that can take those 12-yard digs and turn them into 25 and 30 plus yard gains. Or does the Falcons do what we've seen previous Falcon teams do, which is sort of create explosiveness out of structure, right? And I know a lot of people, one of the things that people are hopeful for, and you can maybe hang your hat on, given Mariota's athleticism, that is a way that he can create. We've seen Russell Wilson do that quite a bit in Seattle over the course of his career. I know the Mariota stands watching the podcast aren't necessarily familiar with this because you've only been following the Falcons for the last couple of months, but you go way, way back to 2002, where the Falcons had Michael Vick, obviously a very mobile quarterback. And 2002 is unique in the sort of Vick era because it was basically the only year where the Falcons, at least from a passing standpoint, were sort of in the upper half of the league in terms of generating those explosive 20-plus yard plays. And that a lot of that was based off of Vick sort of extending plays outside the pocket and sort of heaving up balls down the field to a 6'5" receiver in Brian Finneran. And what's unique about Finneran in that season was Finneran, I think, was like 25th in the NFL that year in the explosive plays, 20-plus yard receptions that year, but he was only like 50th in terms of total receptions. So basically, a lot of what Finneran was doing was basically using his size to get open and win in those sort of jump ball situations down the field on those sort of scramble drill type plays. And of course, given Drake London's size, given Kyle Pitts' size, given Bryan Edwards' size, and we'll sort of see if, Auden, Tate, and Geronimo, Allison can get in the mix in that regard. Although, again, I'm not expecting that to be the case, given I see those guys probably not making the roster. But, given the extraordinary size that the Falcons have, that could be a way in which the Falcons can generate those explosive plays. Now, the drawback of that, going back to that Vic offense, which I think epitomizes this style of play, and we've seen this with the Seahawks in recent years with Russell Wilson, is that style of offense tends to be a lot more high variance, right? Meaning that, when your quarterback is doing all that stuff and creating all that off structure stuff, it can be hard to stop, right? Because the defense can scheme it up perfectly. And then the quarterback uses his mobility, uses his legs to sort of break contain. And there's really no defense to stop that because you can't expect corners and safeties to be able to cover for, 5-6 seconds that it takes for the quarterback to, get outside the pocket and locate that receiver down the field. But at the same time, that's not something that you can consistently rely on, down in and down out, series in and series out, game in and game out. So that's what we mean high variance, where, it can be very, very good. And then it can also sort of disappear for you for high stretches. And so, one of the keys when, particularly in the NFL with offenses, you want to find some sort of stabilizing force. And for those sort of high variance offenses, that's really where the running game often comes into place. And that was the case with the Falcons in the Vic years, where they could run the ball pretty effectively. Obviously, Vic being able to provide a big part of that running ability. And we know that Arthur Smith wants to run the football. We know he wants to be a balanced offense. And so we'll just sort of have to see if this year's team can do that. Certainly Friday's game, they did run the ball effectively. It's hard to sort of glean too much from preseason games, given, you were facing the Lions, who had one of the worst run defenses in the league last year. They're not really game planning for you. You're not necessarily having them, play their starters going all out in that sort of sense, sort of scheming up ways and making adjustments to what you're doing offensively. So it's hard to sort of take that performance against the Lions and say, oh, we ran the ball really effectively against the Lions, which they did. And that means we're going to do that effectively in the regular season, particularly against probably better defenses like, we guys will see in the early days of the season. So we'll see how that plays out, but that's going to be something to keep an eye on. Certainly, I think, if you're putting a lot of hopes on that sort of high variance style of offense, with Marcus Mariota at the helm, you need that running game to sort of take off this year. And so you kind of need, 1,000-yard sort of season from Tyler Algier. You kind of need zero drop off in terms of rushing production from Cordero Patterson in that regard to sort of facilitate that sort of stabilizing force for that sort of high variance offense. The other factor, that causes me to give a little bit pause of whether or not the Falcons can achieve that is that, those Mariota Titans teams never were really that explosive relative to other teams in the NFL. Their best season, their most explosive season offensively was 2016, where I think they were like 15th in generating those 20 plus yard plays. Every other year that Mariota was the starter, they were sort of below average in terms of explosiveness. Obviously, things turned around for the Titans in 2019 when Ryan Tannehill came into the lineup, but they weren't particularly explosive in those first 5 or so games where Mariota was the starter. Hey, had they maintained the pace that they had set in those first 5 games, they would have been still a below average explosive offense. But to be fair to Mariota, that's not all his fault. Obviously those early years in Tennessee, they weren't necessarily known for having great receivers, and certainly part of the issue of maybe why the offense became more explosive under Tannehill than they were under Mariota in that 2019 season was A.J. Brown did miss time in the early part of that season, and then was healthy once Tannehill sort of took over the lineup, and so Tannehill benefited from having that big time that prototypical X receiver in the lineup there. So we'll see if Mariota can sort of break the mold and deliver on that explosiveness, whether it's within structure or out of structure this upcoming season. But ultimately, despite all my anti-Mariota rhetoric on the podcast recently and on Twitter and elsewhere, it's not that I'm down on Mariota. It's not to sit here and say I think he's a bad quarterback. I think he's a perfectly competent NFL quarterback. I'm just not necessarily invested in the Falcons sort of attaching themselves to the hip of Marcus Mariota. So I'm not really that invested in, him doing well, maybe unlike a lot of you guys out there. But I do think the value of what Mariota is going to bring, in addition to, keeping this guy from murdering Desmond Ridder, pointing to the Aaron Donald poster behind me for the audio listeners, is that Mariota gives you a level of competent quarterback play that's going to allow you to evaluate guys like Drake London and Bryan Edwards and Kyle Pitts to a lesser extent, so that when, this team is rebuilding, they want to have informed opinions on how strong the receiver core is. And, one of the issues I have that despite all the great size that the Falcons have, again, that could be conducive to being this high variance sort of, out of structure, explosive offense, I do think they will benefit potentially. And we'll just sort of have to see in the future by adding, a receiver that can generate separation and take the top off of the defense, which is part of the reason why, like, had I had my druthers, had the Falcons taken a wide receiver at 8, I would have preferred Jamison Williams to be that type of receiver, because to me, he's like a perfect fit in that type of role. But we'll see if Drake London can shut me up, as well as Bryan Edwards, as well as, what Auden Tate and Geronimo Allison and some of these other receivers can do with Drake London's potential absence moving forward, guys. So that's it. We'll be back tomorrow. I don't know if we'll have a guest. I have to confirm if he'll be here tomorrow, but should have a guest later this week, in addition, to get you geared up for what else is going on in Falcons training camp. And maybe we'll talk about some other positions, and maybe, just maybe, we might spend more than 5 minutes talking about, that island boy, Omarita, Marcus Mariota in that, or I'm sorry, Mariota, because, I know some of you guys get mad that I say Mare instead of Mar, I'm a Georgia boy, talking about Marietta, Georgia. So Mariota is that island boy. So anyway, guys, I'm done talking here at the end of the show. We will leave it there, guys. Really appreciate you tuning in. Go check out all of the Locked On Sports Atlanta shows, including Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, and of course, check out Locked On Fantasy Football, where Vinny Iyer has 20 years of NFL expertise to help you get geared up for this upcoming fantasy football season. Locked On Fantasy Football is free and available Monday through Friday on your preferred podcast app, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. So guys, really appreciate it. Till then.